Have you ever noticed how losing someone can completely change the people around you? I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but here I am. 3 years ago, I had everything loving parents, a seemingly perfect marriage, and what I thought was a caring husband, Mark. My parents were the kind of people who lit up every room they walked into. Mom was this amazing baker who'd surprise me with my favorite chocolate chip cookies whenever I had a bad day, even after I moved out and got married. Dad was the guy who could fix anything from broken pipes to broken hearts. They were my rock, my safety net, my everything. Mark and I got married in a beautiful garden ceremony. My dad cried while walking me down the aisle, and my mom couldn't stop taking pictures. Mark seemed perfect back then, always calling my parents for Sunday dinner, helping Dad with house repairs, and even learning Mom's secret recipe for her famous lasagna. Then came that horrible Tuesday morning. I was at work when I got the call. A drunk driver had run a red light. Both my parents. Gone. Just like that. The next few days were a blur of funeral arrangements, tears, and countless hugs from people I barely knew. Mark was there through it all, holding my hand, making phone calls, and handling the paperwork. I thought I was so lucky to have him. But something changed after the funeral. It started small, so small I almost missed it. The first time I noticed was when I was crying while looking at old family photos. Instead of comforting me like he used to, Mark just sighed heavily. "You need to move on," he said. "They're not coming back." His words stung, but I told myself he was right. Maybe I was grieving too much. Maybe he was just trying to help me heal. But then things got worse. When I mentioned visiting my parents' grave one morning, Mark rolled his eyes. "Again? Don't you think it's time to stop this nonsense?" I started noticing more changes. Our joint bank account, the one my parents had helped us set up, suddenly had new restrictions. "I'm just protecting our future," Mark said when I questioned him. But something in his voice felt different, colder. One evening, after I spent the day cleaning out my parents' house, Mark was waiting for me at home. His face was hard, unfamiliar. "Now there's no one behind you," he said with a smirk. "No daddy to run to, no mommy to cry to. It's just us now." I stood there, frozen, as the meaning of his words sank in. This wasn't the man I married. This was someone else, someone who had been waiting for my support system to disappear. Someone who had been wearing a mask all along. The house I once called home started feeling like a prison. Mark began monitoring my phone calls, questioning every expense, and making comments about how dependent I was on him now. The sweet gestures were gone, replaced by cruel remarks and cold shoulders. Every day felt heavier than the last. Mark started selling my parents things without asking me. "We need the space," he'd say, or "it's just gathering dust each time something disappeared." It felt like losing a piece of them all over again. The worst part? He was smart about it. In front of others, he was still the grieving son-in-law, the supportive husband helping his wife through a difficult time. But behind closed doors, that's where the real Mark came out. I remember one night, I was on the phone with my best friend Sarah. Mark walked in, and his face changed instantly. He stood there, arms crossed, watching me. After I hung up, he exploded. "Why are you always whining to people about your problems? Do you know how pathetic you sound?" The control got worse. He started checking my location through my phone. "I just worry about you," he'd say, but his eyes told a different story. When I got home late from work one day, he had already called my office twice. "Just making sure you're actually at work," he said with that new, cold smile of his. Our joint account became his weapon. Every purchase I made needed explaining. A $5 coffee? "Why are you wasting our money? A new shirt for work? You're getting fat anyway. It won't look good." Everything became his business, his decision. One Sunday morning, I found him in our home office, going through my parents' old documents. "What are you doing?" I asked, my heart racing. He didn't even look up. "Looking for their will. There must be something worth selling." That's when I lost it. "Those are my parents' things," I shouted. "You can't just..." He cut me off, standing up so quickly that his chair fell backward. "I can't," what he sneered, getting in my face. "What are you going to do about it? Run to mommy and daddy? Oh wait, you can't. They're dead and you're stuck with me." I ran to our bedroom, locked the door, and cried. Through the door, I could hear him laughing. "You know what's funny?" he called out. "Your parents never really liked me. Guess they were smarter than you." That night, lying in bed, pretending to sleep while Mark snored beside me, I realized something terrifying. My parents had been my safety net, my support system, my escape plan if anything ever went wrong. Mark knew that. He'd been waiting for them to be gone. The next morning, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. My eyes had dark circles, my face was pale, and I barely recognized myself anymore. How had I let things get this bad? What would my parents think if they could see me now? I opened the medicine cabinet, and something fell out, an old envelope. My hand shook as I picked it up. It was my mom's handwriting. "For our darling daughter, open when you need us most." That envelope. I can't explain why, but holding it made my hands tremble. I sat on the bathroom floor, my back against the cold tiles, and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter and a small key. My dearest daughter, Mom's handwriting was as neat as ever. If you're reading this, it means you need us right now. Your father and I always knew that life wouldn't always be easy for you. Call us overprotective, but we never fully trusted Mark. I had to stop reading for a moment. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. They knew? All this time? We've watched how he tries to control small things, how he tenses up when you make decisions without him. Baby girl, we've been setting something aside for you. The key is for a safety deposit box at First National Bank, box 247. Whatever you're going through, know that we've got your back, even now. Tears rolled down my cheeks, but for the first time in months, they weren't just sad tears. My parents hadn't just left me, they'd left me a lifeline. I waited until Mark left for his Sunday golf game. He always took his phone, but I knew he wouldn't check my location during golf. He was too busy showing off to his friends. I drove to the bank, my hands shaking as I held the key. The safety deposit box contained another letter, documents, and bank statements. But what caught my eye was a small blue bank book. They'd been saving for years, putting aside money in a secret account. The balance made me gasp, enough to start over, enough to escape. But that wasn't all. As I read through the documents, I found records of every conversation they'd had with Mark when I wasn't around. Times he'd made subtle threats, times he'd tried to convince them to change their will. They'd documented everything. Mrs. Carter, a voice startled me. I turned to see Mrs. Peterson, my parents' old friend and our family lawyer. Your mother asked me to be here on the first Sunday you opened this box. I broke down crying, and she hugged me tight. They knew, I whispered. They knew, and they prepared. Your parents were smart people, she said gently. They also asked me to give you this. She handed me a USB drive. It has recordings of conversations with Mark. They never trusted him, sweetheart. And they made sure you'd have proof if you ever needed it. For the first time in months, I felt something other than fear and sadness. I felt hope, and something else, anger. Pure, justified anger at what Mark had done, at how he'd treated me, at how he'd probably been planning this all along. I don't know what to do next, I admitted to Mrs. Peterson. She smiled, reminding me so much of my mom that it hurt. We do. Your parents and I created a detailed plan. Would you like to hear it? Over the next few days, with Mrs. Peterson's help, I began setting things in motion. Every time Mark left for work, I followed my parents' plan step by step. First, I secretly moved all their important photos and small keepsakes to a storage unit. Then, I started collecting evidence, recording his outbursts, taking screenshots of his controlling texts, and documenting every cruel word. But the hardest part? Acting normal. Pretending everything was fine while my heart raced every time he walked into the room. You're quieter than usual, he mentioned one evening, his eyes narrowing. I forced a smile. Just tired from work, I said. And he seemed satisfied. Mrs. Peterson helped me open a new bank account. Your mother always said you were stronger than you knew, she told me as we filled out the paperwork. She was right. One Friday, Mark came home to find me in the kitchen, cooking dinner like any other day. But this wasn't any other day. The house smelled like my mom's lasagna, the recipe he'd once pretended to love. What's the occasion, he asked, suspicion in his voice. I took a deep breath. Found some of Mom's old recipes, I said, placing his plate in front of him. Thought it would be nice. He scoffed. Still hanging on to their memory? When will you grow up? That's when I did it. I placed the envelope of evidence on the table. His face changed as he opened it, photos of my bruised arms from when he'd grabbed me, screenshots of his threatening texts, bank statements showing how he'd been stealing from my inheritance, and transcripts of his conversations with my parents. What is this, he sputtered, his face turning red. This, I said, my voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. Is my parents still protecting me? They knew what you were, Mark. They knew, and they made sure I'd have a way out. He stood up so fast his chair crashed to the floor. You think anyone will believe you? It's your word against mine. I pulled out my phone, showing him it was recording. It's your word against yours. Everything you've said, everything you've done, it's all documented. And guess what? The police already have copies. His face went from red to white. You wouldn't dare. The woman you thought was weak because she lost her parents? She's gone. I'm my parents' daughter, and they taught me to fight back. Just then, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Peterson walked in with 2 police officers. I watched as they read him his rights, charges of emotional abuse, financial fraud, and theft. His face as they led him away. I'll never forget it. That night, for the first time in months, I slept peacefully in my parents' old house. Mrs. Peterson helped me move back there temporarily. As I lay in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by memories of happier times, I felt both sad and relieved. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings and court appearances. Mark's true colors showed during the divorce proceedings. He tried to claim I was mentally unstable, that I'd made everything up because I couldn't cope with my parents' death. But the evidence was too strong. Those recordings my parents had made, the documented abuse, the financial trials. His perfectly crafted mask crumbled in front of everyone. His family was shocked. His mother, who'd always bragged about raising a perfect gentleman, couldn't look me in the eye when the truth came out. His father, a respected businessman, had to watch his son's crimes being read out in court. It turns out I wasn't the only one he'd fooled. But you know what the strangest part was? With each passing day, I felt stronger. Every time I decided without asking for permission, every time I bought something without feeling guilty, every time I went somewhere without explaining myself, I felt more like me again. One Sunday morning, about 3 months after everything happened, I visited my parents' grave. This time I wasn't crying. "You guys knew," I said, placing fresh flowers on their headstone. "You knew and you protected me, even after you were gone." I told them about how their secret account had helped me restart my life, how their detailed records had ensured justice, and how their love had given me the strength to fight back. "I wish you were here," I said, "but in a way, you never really left." As I stood there, the morning sun warming my face, I remembered something my mom used to say: sometimes the hardest storms in life show us just how strong we are. She was right. I'd weathered this storm and I'd come out stronger. Today, I'm living in a new apartment, working at a job I love, and slowly rebuilding my life. I've started volunteering at a domestic abuse support group, sharing my story with others who need to hear that they're not alone, that they can escape, that they're stronger than they know. Sometimes people ask me if I regret marrying Mark, if I wish I'd seen the signs earlier, but I don't see it that way. This experience taught me something valuable: that evil doesn't always look evil at first, that strength can come from unexpected places, and that love, real love, protects and empowers. My parents might not be here physically, but their love and protection never left me. They taught me that family isn't just about being there in the good times, it's about preparing those you love for the bad times too. And sometimes, just sometimes, that love is strong enough to reach beyond death itself. As for Mark, last I heard, he's facing serious jail time. But honestly, I don't think about him much anymore. I'm too busy living my life, honoring my parents' memory, and being thankful for the gift they left me: not just the money or the evidence, but the strength to stand up for myself when it mattered most. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. It's not about how evil people can be, but about how love, real, unconditional love, can protect us even when we think we're all alone. And that's something worth remembering. It's been a year since everything happened. Life has a funny way of coming full circle, doesn't it? Remember that support group I mentioned? Well, something amazing happened there last month. A young woman came in, shaking and scared, just like I had been. Her story was different, but the fear in her eyes was the same. When I shared my experience, she started crying. "My mom passed away last year," she said, "and ever since then, my husband." She couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. I knew exactly what she meant. That Sunday, after the meeting, I introduced her to Mrs. Peterson. Together, we helped her create an escape plan, just like my parents had done for me. You know what's beautiful? My parents' protection didn't just save me, it's now helping others too. That secret account they left me? I've used part of it to start a foundation that helps people escape abusive relationships. We named it Sunday's Promise because Sundays will always remind me of the day I found their letter. Last week, I was cleaning out some old boxes and found our wedding album. Looking at those pictures felt strange, like watching a movie where you know the villain's true identity, but the main character doesn't. The smiling man in those photos seems like a stranger now. My old wedding ring sits in a small box in my drawer. Sometimes people ask why I keep it. To remember, I tell them. Not to remember him, but to remember that strength can come from unexpected places, that love can protect us in ways we never imagined, and that sometimes the hardest goodbyes lead to the best new beginnings. I've started dating again, slowly and cautiously. But this time, I'm different. I'm not looking for someone to complete me or protect me. I already know how to do that for myself. Instead, I'm looking for someone who understands that real love doesn't control or diminish, it empowers and uplifts. The other day, I found an old note from my mom in her cookbook. "Remember, sweetheart," it said, "the best recipes, like the best parts of life, are the ones we discover through trial and error." She was right. As usual, my life might not have followed the recipe I originally planned, but maybe that's okay. Every Sunday, I still visit my parents' grave, but now I bring good news stories about the women we've helped, updates about the foundation, and little victories from my new life. Sometimes I think I can hear Mom saying, "That's my girl," or feel Dad's proud smile. To anyone reading this who might be going through something similar, remember this: you are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and never as alone as you feel. Sometimes the hardest storms in life show us just how strong we are. And sometimes, just sometimes, love finds ways to protect us even after it's gone. Because in the end, that's what my parents taught me, that real love, true love, never dies. It just transforms into something else: strength, courage, and the power to not just survive, but to thrive. And that's the greatest gift they could have ever left me.